Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Kawa, and I'm coming to you today from the shared territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And to start our day in a good way, I want to turn to our development board chair, Alan Claxton, who has a lot of experience with infrastructure projects in his own community, serving as chief, serving as councillor. And how are things in Tsleil territory today, Alan?
Very good. It's warming up and the days are getting longer, and it seems like we've been through a lot, everyone through this winter, especially because of the shortened days and the darkness and the gloom. And it's encouraging to see the weather starting to turn. So I want to welcome everybody to the number 4, the webinar today, and acknowledge the territories that are represented here. When I was the chief, I used the tools of the First Nation Tax Commission to take over property tax, and the tools from Fiscal Realities to develop a sale tax law and implement the GST. Those revenues all stay in our community now, and helps us to build the infrastructure that we need that help us prosper and continue to move forward. So let's get right into this webinar today, and keep in mind the people that are still going through hard times because of the pandemic. The good news is that a lot of our communities are going to start the vaccinations. Ours starts next week for the elders, and just I may look young, but I'm an elder now, and I'll be up there getting my first shot next week. And so with that, let's keep in mind and pray for the ones that are going through hard times, especially the elders and the youth. And if you have time, give someone a call and encourage them and support them, and give them the strength to keep moving forward to get through this. So with that, Jason, let's get right into this webinar and start sharing this valuable information. Haishka CM, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Alan. Always good to start our day in a good way with some reflection and a prayer. And my hands are up to you for those good words to get us started. So yeah, some of you may be new to the webinar series, and I thought it might be helpful to just do a bit of a summary. I'm just going to share screen here about where we're at with this webinar series. It has been called a sort of shovel-ready webinar series. I know this term you may have heard from time to time in the press. What the heck does shovel-ready mean anyway? It really, shovel-ready is a term that refers to a stage of a project where it's ready to go, where the construction can start, the due diligence is done, all the planning work, good planning work has been completed. And so we've been talking a little bit in the early webinars about is my project shovel ready? What work has been done to the project? What work needs to be done in order for the project to be shovel ready? What kind of planning work? Is there a feasibility study? Have I done the business case? What are the parts of the business case that need to be done? How are we going to procure the project? These are the kinds of things that we've talked about so far. And so today we're in webinar 4. We're talking about a couple of examples, really some of the concepts that we've talked about, really applying them, which is, I think, why it's going to be, not to say that there's a competition among the webinars, but I think this is going to be a really interesting one because we get to talk about projects and apply the concepts. Next week, just as a bit of a teaser too, we hope you'll come back and join us because there's we're going to have representatives from the different fiscal institutions, the tax commission, the financial management board, and the finance authority, talking about getting the financial plan together and funding your projects. So we're going to talk about 2 scenarios today. Hope you join us tomorrow. This is a simplified project life cycle that we put together to think through about getting your project ready, going from the pre-planning through the feasibility study and the business case, procurement all the way through to the, it's maybe not accurate time-wise, because we know we're focused a lot on the planning, the upfront stuff here, but we know the operation and maintenance is such an important part, and it actually is, most of the time on the timeline, really, going out to replacement. So we know that different nations will have strengths in certain areas, and they've built up these strengths probably as a result of the way the system is structured, in a way, the way the ISK funding system works, and you probably thought about getting your project team together and doing some pre-planning. Maybe you've done some comprehensive community planning or land use plan, and probably many of you are familiar with doing the feasibility studies, in construction. But there's other parts of the life cycle that we think are important as well. We know there's all of these things in the life cycle have to get done in some way, shape, or form for the project to be successful. And the idea of FINI, the First Nation Infrastructure Institute, is really to provide support. It's an optional, an opt-in approach similar to the Fiscal Management Act, to be established as part of the Fiscal Management Act, and to provide that support in areas where you may want to have support. Really, that's similar, building on similar ideas to the other institutes, standardized best practices, center of excellence, and so that's what FINI's really about. And we're happy that you've joined us to talk about these things today. I see Davis has just put in the chat box there about the previous webinars you can see online. There's a few tools available as well that we've been developing to try and support some of these different things. Things like what is a business case? That was one of the topics in one of the webinars, looking through the business case meant to be a one-stop shop for people to understand all the aspects of your project. And we've got a template on the webpage, on the resources page. If you go to fini.ca, you can download it, and really talks about these different components of what you probably should have as part of your plan to make your project shovel ready. You should have a strategic case. That's the why are you doing the project? How does it connect to your community priorities? Does it connect to your comprehensive community plan or other plans that you've done? You maybe have a multi-year capital plan. How does this project connect to that? What about the economics of the project? Have you thought about the scope of the project? And this is really where the feasibility study fits in. What kind of technology options are available? How big is the project? Who's connected, for example, to the water system? Is it every part of the reserve, or does it make sense to connect every part? Or are there certain areas that makes more sense and other areas it doesn't? And how do you think that through? And how do you come up with some you probably heard the term like Class C cost estimates, for example. That's the economic case. The commercial case, thinking through how you're going to reach outside your organization and find a partner to work with you to deliver the project, and how you're going to manage the risks through that procurement. The financial case, we're going to get into actually quite a bit of detail today, which will be great. Thinking through how to build your financial plan on these two scenarios that we're going to talk about. And last but not least, the management case. How are you going to manage the project? And this is from the pre-planning all the way through, just in those life cycle steps. So there's some information about that business case that's available. I encourage you to check it out. This is just a little bit more of context just before we pass it over to our panelists. But this is a little bit more detailed version of the process, we think, to develop a project. We titled it the FINI process. You're probably familiar with a lot of these steps. I just talked a lot about the business case component in the last slide, which you can see in the second row there. There's also some steps through the procurement and through the implementation and operations. And I think you'll probably hear about some of these different steps as we talk about the project. So I reference these slides by really just way of introduction and context to say that we've talked about a few of these things. We're building on concepts each and every webinar. And today we're going from the abstract, from this process to to actual projects. And I'm really happy that we're joined by two of the Finney technical team members, John Dumbrell and Jason Reeves. We're fortunate to have them as part of the team. John has 3 decades of experience working on infrastructure projects, both with Indigenous communities and with other governments in Canada. And Jason has 2 decades of experience working with a lot of Indigenous groups, especially focused on the tools of the Fiscal Management Act. So I'm really happy you can join us today, John and Jason. And at this point, I'm going to stop talking and pass it over to you, John.
Great. Thanks very much, Jason and Alan for the introductory words, and good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you this morning from Secwepemc territory in Kamloops, British Columbia, and really happy to have the opportunity to work with the group this morning through these, as Jason has described them, a couple of illustrative scenarios. So just kind of by way of introduction here, some background to these project scenarios that we're going to talk about. So what we'd like to work through this morning is how to plan for projects that meet both member as well as economic development needs. What we're seeing is as more and more nations are choosing to use portions of their lands for economic development purposes, there are a couple of situations that are really becoming more prominent. One where we see where linear infrastructure, and what I would refer to by linear infrastructure would be things like water system, like we can imagine the water pipes within the road network, wastewater collection and treatment systems, the road network itself. All of those things would be referred to as linear infrastructure. So we see lots of examples there where that infrastructure will serve both member needs as well as economic development initiatives as well. Then a second situation we're seeing quite often is where there would be a multi-purpose building, which the nation has chosen to put within its lands. And again, that building or complex of buildings again will serve both member as well as economic development needs. So I wanted to go into a little more detail about each of those 2 different scenarios here in a couple of minutes. Second thing I want to work through this morning is how the cost for the projects can be allocated in a fair and equitable manner. And as Jason Callum mentioned, Jason Reeves, we're really fortunate to have Jason join us this morning. And so Jason will be working through quite a bit more detail in terms of what that cost allocation could look like. As part of that, the allocating costs, we can imagine that there are different funding sources that could be brought to bear and revenue streams that could be brought to bear and combined into one project. So again, we'll talk about that this morning. And then with the First Nations Infrastructure Institute, this evolving institute in Canada to complement others that are in place, the Finance Authority, the Financial Management Board, and the Tax Commission, how Finney as the 4th institution within the Fiscal Management Act can support nations in this whole process of planning and funding and procuring infrastructure projects. So with that, if could move on to the next slide here. Thank you. So in many cases, it doesn't make sense to build 2 infrastructure systems, whether they be the linear infrastructure that I was referring to and that we'd like to work through here, or the buildings. And so maybe before we start to dive into some of the detail here, we could think about, well, why not build 2? Why not have a separate system for economic development initiatives and a separate system to serve member needs? Well, there's a couple of key reasons why we feel that a single infrastructure system is way more beneficial for the community in most cases. First off would be something we refer to as economies of scale. So what's generally much less expensive to build and to operate one system rather than 2. In other words, one water system rather than 2 separate ones. One wastewater system rather than 2. One building that can serve a number of needs as opposed to separate buildings. So this whole notion of economies of scale is really important. A second reason why often one infrastructure system makes more sense is efficiencies. So we're thinking about the supply of water, we're thinking about the treatment of wastewater, we're thinking about a single building. Often it's much more efficient to operate one as opposed to 2 separate ones. We're saying that another way, it becomes much more complex if we're operating 2 separate systems rather than one. And a third reason why thinking about 1 rather than 2 or 3 is this notion of complementarity. And this we see especially with respect to buildings. And that's one of the scenarios that we'd like to work through this morning. So we think of complementary uses that could take place within a building or within a cluster of buildings. So the kinds of examples we see in many nations would be, for example, a daycare and a senior center locating within a single building, or a health and wellness center along with a recreation and community center, where there's very complementary activities that can take place within those different uses. For example, a daycare and a senior center where elders are welcomed and accommodated to take place within close proximity of one another. And so those are the kind of, again, another idea why this complementarity, another idea why it makes sense to do, in many cases, one set of infrastructure assets as opposed to two. Okay, so now moving on to these couple of scenarios. The first one here, as I mentioned, many nations are developing linear infrastructure, and we'll concentrate this morning on water as an example of that. But again, we could talk about wastewater systems or roads. But for this example, linear infrastructure, many nations are developing that to serve both member needs as well as economic development initiatives. So thinking about the strategic objectives of the nations, why would we want to do that? Well, these are often expressed through things, as Jason mentioned earlier, documents such as a comprehensive community plan, chief and council and staff strategic plan. And they would contain often objectives such as delivering clean water to all, really important, whether that's for members or for economic development initiatives. Ensuring sufficient supply is available, in the case of water here again, to meet the demands under all conditions. And so that could be for domestic use, that could be for higher use in the summertime in order to, if there are community gardens, those kinds of things that require irrigation. That certainly could be for fire protection, where water is stored and available for use in the event that there is a fire within the community. So those are the kinds of objectives that we often see expressed within something like a comprehensive community plan or a strategic plan for why a water system is available. To add economic development into the mix there, the nation may have chosen to have, again, economic development initiatives within the lands, and those could require water supply for basic needs such as drinking and washing and showers and so forth, or in other cases for more like a commercial or industrial processing, like a food processing facility. So then we start to think about the economic development needs of water supply, again, expressed through a comprehensive community or strategic plan, and takes us back to this question about, does it make sense for us to develop one water system to service all those needs, both of members and of economic development? We've added land use plan here in terms of a strategic objective. What we often find is that if a comprehensive community plan document or a standalone land use plan is prepared for the community, those are very, very helpful in defining linear infrastructure and what those related needs are. And so, for example, what the different land uses and where those will be geographically located within the community, and we'll look at an example of this in a moment. And then also the demands that could arise from those different kinds of land uses. There we can imagine, for example, residential demand for single family homes will be quite different from a community facility and could be quite different from an economic development initiative, especially those that would use considerable water supplies. So it's very helpful to have a land use plan, both for the geographic extent of water use within the community, as well as for assessing demands. If we put all of those pieces together, that really helps to inform what Jason mentioned a couple of minutes ago, which is the strategic case as part of that overall business case. The first piece of it is the strategic case. In this case, why we would need a water supply, who it's going to serve, and how. And so here we'd like to look at this example of a project which is serving multiple user groups. And so if I might please have the next slide. Okay, so here we're imagining a community which comprises a number of different land uses within their land base that the community holds. And I'll just walk us through the different land uses that are shown here. So in the solid yellow color here, we have the member residential area existing. So these are where nation members live, could be in single family homes, could be in elders homes or townhome developments or any of those forms of residential use. Then beyond the current member residential, this community that's depicted here is expecting expecting and welcoming future member residential development. What we're seeing with many nations is a strong desire for people to move back to home communities. And so in this hypothetical community here, we see an area set aside for that future residential use. In green, we've shown here community buildings. And so here we can imagine the nation's administration office, recreation facilities, health and wellness center, recreation facilities, perhaps a fire hall, those kinds of things. So community serving buildings, a school would be another great example, that are serving the broader community needs. Okay, moving on to the areas shown both in solid purple as well as the purple hatch here. Again, this is a nation which has chosen, this hypothetical nation has chosen to use a portion of their lands and lease those for waterfront leases. So that's the area that's shown in the solid purple. And then the nation may also have said within the comprehensive community plan and the land use plan that we're anticipating more of that waterfront leased area for development. It's been a really economically beneficial area for their community. And so we're anticipating developing more of that. That's the land that's shown in the hatched purple. And then finally, the commercial center is shown in red there. So that could be, for example, convenience store, gas station, pardon me, a commercial plaza, those kinds of activities happening within the area shown in red. So this gives us a sense of that land use plan and both geographically where the water demands would be located, and then also a sense of what the extent might be for the different kinds of demand, residential, commercial, and so on. Okay, over to the next slide, please. Then we need again to think about how our linear infrastructure, our water supply, is going to serve those multiple user groups that we just looked at. So this is really important now to think about a feasibility study. And what those feasibility study, again, as Jason mentioned earlier, really look at is what would be the technical solution. In this case would be from an engineering perspective. What's the technical solution for deriving our water supply and treating that to make sure that it's potable for everyone? Where would the water treatment plant, the WTP water treatment plant site be located, and how would the distribution network work to carry water to each of those individual land uses that we just saw? And then providing what we would call in the feasibility study a conceptual level cost estimate. In the engineering world, those are terms like Class C or Class D cost estimates, which is a decent cost estimate, but there's some contingency built in because there would still be uncertainties at this stage. And so that's so with that land use plan, in order to provide water to it, a feasibility study is conducted. And that really forms, again, as Jason mentioned a few moments ago, the economic case as part of the overall business case. Over to the next slide, please. So here we see the same land use plan. And here we look at this conceptual level water servicing plan that would provide water to each of those different areas of the community. We've shown it broken down into the supply. So not surprisingly, in this case, it would come out of the lake that's available to the community. Then the water is conveyed up to a treatment plant. From there over to a storage tank to provide water for higher levels of demand, for example, maximum day demand in the summertime and fire protection. And then it's distributed out through the hatch black line to service all of both the existing community, as well as we'll note there that it also is going to serve the future residential areas, future areas, both the member residential area in the hatched yellow, as well as the future waterfront lease lots in the hatched purple. So at this stage, then we've got, we know the lands that are being serviced, we know the uses of those lands, and we have a sense of what that system would look like and also the costs that would be associated with it. Again, coming out of the feasibility study that I mentioned a moment ago. Over to the next slide, please. So then the big question, okay, so there's all of these costs, both to build this system as well as to operate it. And so, in a moment here, Jason Reeves is going to take us through some more detailed ideas in terms of how costs are recovered. Before we get into, though, thinking about the more detailed cost recovery mechanisms, it's important to think about what we would call principles for cost recovery. The first of those is the benefiter pays. And so again, we saw those various different land uses. We saw the members and the community uses that will benefit from the water supply. We saw commercial development on leased lands that would benefit from the water supply. And we also saw the leased lands, the waterfront leased lands, both current and future, that will benefit from the water supply. So those are all the different benefiting groups, each of whom should be looked to fund a portion of the infrastructure. In terms of how much would be funded, the notion of fair and equitable allocation we see as really important here. If a portion, I'll use commercial development as example, if they're using most of the water, then they should also be allocated most of the cost. Or if the leased lands, the waterfront leased lands are using most of the water, they should be allocated the bulk of the cost. And then finally, administrative efficiency, always an important consideration here. Don't want to make the cost recovery approaches so complex that it becomes very difficult for the nation to administer those. So those are just some basic principles. And then in terms of the actual mechanics, if you will, of allocating the costs of the water infrastructure, there we see the capital costs. So these would be the costs of the pipes, the treatment plant, the storage tank, and so forth. Those typically are allocated on the basis of the capacity that is being built for that particular use. How much of the capacity of the treatment plant is for example, the lease lots. And then for the operating costs, the ongoing costs for the electricity, if there's chemicals involved in treatment, and those kinds of things, more typically allocated on the basis of use, how much volume of water is used by the different users. So those are some, again, thinking through this, who are the users, what is the infrastructure being built to supply them, how are we going to allocate the cost? And this begins to take us into that kind of a conversation. So with that, if I may, Alan and Jason, I'd like to turn that over to Jason Reeves, please.
Right on. Yeah, thanks, John. So if we think about that principle of benefiter pays that John just spoke about, and about the different beneficiaries of services in this scenario, we can break down the cost recovery into two parts. So first, we can consider the portion of costs associated with providing services to member residential areas and community buildings, the yellow and green areas on John's map. And second, the portion of costs associated with providing services to leasehold residential and economic development parcels, the purple and red areas on John's map. So one of the primary purposes of FINI is to provide capacity support services to nations to build more sustainable infrastructure assets. And so part of this means assisting nations in developing a financial model for projects that utilize a whole of life approach to ensure that assets are sustainable and operate, for their expected design life. So in a whole of life costing approach, that would consider capital costs, operations and maintenance costs, or O&M, and asset management costs, which are the life cycle renewal costs. So to be sustainable, the project's whole of life financial model should identify appropriate funding sources and revenue streams to satisfy each of those costs and ensure sufficient funds are available at the time when those costs are expected to be incurred over the project's life cycle. So this slide addresses the first bit, the portion of costs associated with providing services to member residences and community buildings. And looking first at capital costs, so FINI could help nations to develop a financial model that goes first to Canada, seeking contributions for the project for that portion of costs related to servicing member residences and community buildings. So this could take the form of a one-time upfront contribution from Canada, or potentially contributions over time. FINI and the other institutions that were established under the Fiscal Management Act being mentioned. So all of them are working with Canada on new funding innovations, and the slide here notes monetization. So this is just simply a way for Canada to make contributions over time and for nations to be able to build infrastructure sooner. So let's suppose a nation has a guaranteed stream of capital transfers coming from Canada, say over the next 10 years. Monetization just means that the nation could use that stream to secure financing for construction of an asset today and then pay it off with the annual contributions over the next 10 years, rather than waiting the 10 years and saving up those transfers from Canada and building the asset in 10 years' time. So yeah, now turning to the operations, the ongoing operations and maintenance costs and asset management costs that will be incurred after the asset is built. Again, Finney could help the nation to develop a financial model that looks to Canada for contributions. There's a note there. So just last month, the Auditor General released a report highlighting the problems with the outdated formula that Canada has been using for the last 30 years to determine O&M funding. And in response, Canada has committed to improving the way that it provides O&M funding to nations. So again, here we're saying that Finney would work with Canada to explore better approaches to O&M funding, including, improved formulas. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, so now we look to the other piece of it, the other beneficiaries of services in this scenario, and consider the recovery of costs associated with providing services to leasehold residential units and economic development parcels. Again, looking first at capital costs. Finney would help the nation to develop a financial model that takes advantage of the fiscal powers available under the Fiscal Management Act, or FMA. So when other governments develop infrastructure, they have a variety of tools available to them, including different taxes, fees, and charges. And the Fiscal Management Act provides nations with many similar tools so that nations can decide for themselves how best to pay for their infrastructure. So the fiscal powers under the FMA, or Fiscal Management Act, that are noted here. First one is property tax. This is a very common tool used by other governments and quite a few First Nation governments to raise revenues for broad general purposes, including the provision of infrastructure assets like water and sewer, roads and streets, solid waste and recycling, but also other things like protective services, policing and firefighting, recreation and cultural services, community development, and even contribute to other things like health and education. So an example here is in 2017, the Skokiel First Nation used annual property tax revenues to secure financing for a capital infrastructure project that was called the North Subdivision. The cost of the project was just under $3 million, and Skokiel used its annual property tax revenues to make the payments on the loan, which has a 30-year term. So the second fiscal tool noted on the slide is service taxes. And unlike property taxes, which are collected for broad purposes, a service tax can be used to pay for only a specific project. And all revenues from a service tax must be spent only on the specific service for which they are collected. And service taxes may only be levied for a fixed number of years. And capital projects that may be funded by a service tax include transportation, infrastructure, water and sewer systems, and even park acquisitions and improvements. And the example here is the Akiskanook First Nation in 2016 passed a service tax law to finance a $2 million water system upgrade for a system that serves about 150 residential units in an area called Indian Beach Estates. Yeah, and so construction started the year after they passed the law, construction of the upgrade the year after they passed the law, and then the service tax will be levied for 25 years, which matches the same length of the term of the loan. And the next fiscal tool mentioned on the slide here is development cost charges. So across Canada, these are known by different names: development charges, development levies, capital cost charges, offsite levies, development impact fees. Regardless of the name, they're used to pay for growth-related capital costs associated with new development or redevelopment. So a development cost charge is a one-time charge collected from developers of reserve land and used to offset some of the infrastructure costs directly or indirectly attributable to growth. So the example is Tecumlip's here in Kamloops, recently completed construction of a water reservoir called the North Reservoir Project. And the nation used a combination of ISK funding, about 25%, and then its own contribution from its reserve fund of revenues collected under its development cost charge law, which it passed in 2013. So in this case, the nation didn't need to borrow to complete the project. Whitecap, Dakota, near Saskatoon, they've been collecting development levies since 2016. And the Penticton Indian Band, just back in December, passed a development cost charge law. I should also mention, it's not on this slide or the previous one, but nations do use other revenues for capital costs of infrastructure as well. So earlier and in previous webinars, Alan spoke about how his community used FNGST revenues to help pay for construction of a recreation facility in Sayo. Many nations have used gaming revenues, tobacco tax sharing agreements with provinces, revenues from independent power projects, and other types of revenues to secure financing from the First Nations Finance Authority, which is another one of the institutions established under the Fiscal Management Act. Yeah, so in the whole of life financial model, we look next at operations and maintenance and asset management costs and how they can be recovered from the beneficiaries of the service. So water in this case that we're talking about. And again, the FMA, the Fiscal Management Act, provides some useful tools. So property tax shows up again here. A portion of annual property tax revenues can be used to contribute to annual O&M costs. And even a percentage could be set aside each year in a reserve fund for the replacement of major components down the road or the eventual decommissioning and replacement of the whole asset. And in fact, over 30% of First Nations across Canada have chosen to exercise their property tax jurisdiction and use these revenues to help pay for the cost of providing local services. And then the last fiscal tool noted is fees. Nations can charge fees for the provision of services or for the use of facilities on reserve. And fees can be levied in relation to water, sewer, transportation, waste management, and recreation facilities. Unlike property taxes, fees are collected to fund a specific project. So in this way, fees can provide a more equitable allocation of costs by shifting the burden away from the general tax base and onto those using or directly benefiting from the service. And so for this reason, ratepayers generally support the use of fees because they reflect a benefit or pays approach. Couple of examples, the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation in Ontario. It uses fees to recover O&M costs for water service and for sewer service. And in 2019, the Tsleil-Waututh Nation passed a fee law to recover costs for water, sewer, and solid waste services. So I know I've just briefly touched on these here, but as was said previously, there's going to be, or there already is, additional material posted to Finney's website. And I should also mention that one of the other institutions, the First Nations Tax Commission, the FNTC, so they can support nations in implementing these tools and other ones as well. But also their website has a lot of great resources in a section called the FMA Toolkit. Yeah, can we go to the next one there, please? Right on, thanks. So this is just a summary table, just intended to help organize these different tools that nations can use and reflect this whole of life approach to ensuring asset sustainability. So beneficiaries of the water service are listed in the left-hand column. Tools and approaches to recover capital costs are noted in the center column. And then those tools and approaches to recover O&M and asset management costs are in the right-hand column. And so the first row just considers those costs associated with services to member residential and community buildings. And it shows the focus here is on contributions from Canada for both capital and O&M. And the second row considers costs associated with the services to leasehold residential and economic development parcels. And the focus here is on using those tools of the First Nations Fiscal Management Act for both capital and for O&M. And then the third row, future member residential. So again, focuses on contributions from Canada. And then the final row there, future leasehold residential. Again, this is going to focus on the use of the tools of the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. Just the whole point of all of it here is that Finney can help support nations in sorting out the available options and developing a sustainable financial model that utilizes a combination of the funding sources and revenue streams to pay for a project that serves both economic and community purposes, just like other governments that enjoy the ability to use multiple sources and tools. So I'll throw it back to John to introduce scenario 2.
Yeah, before we get back to John, Jason, I just want to say thanks for that great presentation. And, I know my experience with my own community was we didn't have enough land, actually. So we were looking at acquiring land to add to reserve to our community land base. And one thing that shocked me was that the land costs were actually small compared to the infrastructure costs. Like when we looked at actually the cost of servicing areas for housing, it would just surprise me what the number was. And so that I'm sure that's the experience of a lot of communities. And you see this big number and think, well, how in the heck are we ever going to be able to do this? Do we have to wait, for Canada, to find money? We know there's a huge demand. It takes a long time. But, when we think about through the things that you're talking about here, like these tools exist, is it like a matter of just sort of matching up? And I'm kind of asking a question here, but thinking about the number, not getting so saying it's impossible. There's actually tools that can help us manage these costs over time. And is it fair to say that other governments in Canada have the same problem, and they have developed tools like this to manage these costs over time? I ask that to John or Jason if you'd like to comment about that.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly local governments, Jason. These tools are be very familiar, and they're called different things in different provinces. But absolutely, like thinking about how capital costs are handled, how operating costs are handled, and the tools that are used to recover all of those costs. These would be very familiar to local governments, and then increasingly to nations that are, in particular, again, using some of their lands for economic development purposes, becoming very familiar there. So, Jason?
Great, thanks, John. No, that's very, very helpful, I think. And I just think, we're like, it's not that long. It's hard to, it seems like, it's a long time that the Fiscal Management Act has been around, or nations have been using these tools. It's actually not that long. Like the Indian Act amendment, I think 1988, the Kamloops Amendment, and then Indian Taxation Advisory Board. Some of these tools, the Fiscal Management Act, really only 2005. We're 15 years of having some of these better tools available, and more nations are using them. And it seems to me like part of the thinking around FINI is like, well, how can we make sure that these tools can be, we can bring these tools to bear on projects, right? Like the tools, whether it's the tax law, whether it's the financing, whether it's the strengthened financial management, how do we pull all these tools together into a project plan? So I look forward to hearing about scenario 2, John, and this multi-purpose building.
Okay, thanks, Jason. And just actually, maybe just before we move on to that, another thought that occurs to me with respect to the tools. In working with nations on these, a couple of things that always kind of come to mind with chiefs and councils and the communities are, first off, to make the I guess the way in which they're referenced familiar to the community. So like for example, a developer that might be coming in to develop on some of the commercial lands or develop some of those leasehold lands, there's always a desire to have familiarity, the chief and council to have familiarity with that developer to what the tools are called, whether it's called property tax, whether it's called the user fee is a certain name that's attached to it. Jason Reeves mentioned the different names that could be used for development cost charges like offsite levies or development charges. And so chiefs and councils are always attuned to the fact that the names that are used need to be the same in the First Nations community as are used in the sort of surrounding local government communities, so that there is that familiarity there. We've heard that comment many times. Then specifically with respect to the amounts that are charged, whether it be through property taxes or development charges or levies or user fees, there's always a look at what would be called reference jurisdictions. And so again, these would be the surrounding local governments. So not only would be the names would be familiar, but actually the reference the amounts charged, like when chiefs and councils and the communities are setting the amounts, there's always a look at those neighboring jurisdictions to make sure that there's cost competitiveness, if you will, with the neighboring jurisdictions. And so that I appreciate it's kind of diving into some of the more granularity about what the amounts of charges and what they would be called. But those are things that we've seen working with communities that that they're very sensitive to. So. Okay, scenario number 2. So here we mentioned earlier, we're also seeing these situations where both economic development initiatives and member serving needs are looked to be accommodated within a building, within a single building. And so here we'd like to work through as a second scenario what this multi-purpose building situation might look like. So for example, it could include nation administration offices, health centers, a business office, community or recreation facilities. Again, we'd look to some of the more strategic level things that the nation would have expressed through things like comprehensive community plan or a strategic plan. And here we often see objectives of things such as delivering health services within the community. So rather than members having to travel away for health services that are needed on a relatively frequent basis, that those be provided within the community. Providing indoor recreation facilities, basketball, badminton, gymnasiums for those kinds of uses, which can of course double as community facilities for community meetings. And then also supporting economic development. Again, an objective that we see expressed through many comprehensive community plans and or strategic plans. The land use plan really comes to play here as well too. Mentioned earlier when we were talking about scenario 1 about the way in which the nation may have set up its land base for the different kinds of uses and activities. We found it's very helpful within that land use plan if it's identified where such a multi-purpose building or complex of buildings could be located. In our land use plan we looked at a couple of moments ago, that was that green area which was shown as the community center, community buildings area. So very helpful to think about where this multi-purpose building might be located from a number of perspectives, one of which is servicing, getting water supply to its sanitary sewer roads and so on, but also how it fits in the broader context of the community so that members are easily able to get to it to serve the kinds of needs, some of the needs that we see here, the health center, recreation facilities, and so on. So when thinking through those different strategic objectives, that helps to build the strategic case as part of the business case. In terms of moving forward with it here, again, the value of a feasibility study, which would lay out things like what's the concept for the overall building, its multiple purposes that would be included within that. Preparing like what we would call a conceptual level floor plan. Architects often use the term programming, which we may have heard, which kind of expresses how the different uses would be located relative to one another, how the flow works within the building and so on. And then again, our conceptual level cost estimate, a class C or D estimate here to say, this is what we anticipate the capital cost of the building to be, and also its ongoing operation and maintenance costs. So with that feasibility study completed, that then takes us through this economic case, again, which is part of the overall business case for the building.
John, before we move to the next slide, I find that it very interesting what you mentioned about programming. I know in some areas like health, for example, there's been a lot of thought about how is space used within a building and how do teams work together to minimize the amount, if you're working together closely with someone, you don't want them at the opposite end of the building. Like you may want to have them actually closer, or that's a sort of very simple example, right? But actually thinking about in a real detailed way what you're using the space for and how you're going to use it is an important part.
Yeah, it sure is. And specifically with health, Jason, yeah, it's always been a really important part of it. And then increasingly now, since this, we've all had the lived experience of COVID over the course of the last year. And so it's creating whole new areas around health space planning and the requirements there. And then just while we're on that, Jason, too, another part of the programming, especially in these common buildings, is what we've shown here as common services. So how the washroom facilities, showers, so forth, a kitchen that's involved, how that would be programmed into the building so that it could serve the multiple functions that are located. So yeah, thanks for that really important part of building planning, if you will.
So fair to say probably too with a building that's going to be used by the nation like this, there could be like very specific cultural ideas that would be incorporated that would be pretty helpful. Like if it's a bigger walk-in freezer because you literally want to, you've been hunting and you're going to have a feast in the community, you need it to accommodate specifically the types of activity you have. So I can imagine this planning process having engagement with the project team and good knowledge and would be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Incredibly important. Like whether we think about the expressions on the outside of the building, how it might be designed, how the landscaping is done, so forth. To be culturally reflective, it's really important. And then I love your example of because that's the reality in many of our nation communities where, for example, someone gets a moose and they want to bring it in, and we have to be able to properly prepare a moose for a community event that might be happening in the gymnasium. So things like that are really important when thinking about the building design, and specifically in that case with respect to the kitchen. You can't walk into a little kitchen and say, "How can I hang a moose here?" So, yeah. So this is everyone, I think, on the call can a very conceptual level, just to of what a multi-purpose building might comprise. Just to get a sense of some of the uses that could be located within it. And so what we've shown here, the lighter blue outline around the outside of the building would be kind of the common portions, if you will, the common exterior portions of the building. Now we've got a common area within, which would be the common service washer and kitchen, and you can expand that to shower facilities and so on. And then the individual uses that could be located within it, economic development, healthcare, nation offices, and a large gym area. So then we might think about if how the costs how the cost for a building could be allocated. So kind of in a conceptual way, very similar to what we thought about the principal level when we talked about water systems around benefiter pays and how to and fair and equitable allocation according to how much benefit is received by the different uses that are shown within it. If we recall, with respect to water, we were thinking about things like how much capital is built for the different users along, like how much pipes or how much of the storage reservoir is dedicated to each of the users, and then for the operating cost, we thought about the actual use of water. When it comes to buildings, the apportionment of costs based on those kinds of principles work more along the lines of, if we think about the outer shell of the building, so this would be the area shown in the lighter blue, and then of course the roof over top, and any of the common components like an HVAC system. Generally, those would be according to the portion of the overall building that's occupied by each use. So in this case here, something in the range of probably 35 or 40% of this overall building footprint would be comprised by the gym. So then the gymnasium would be looked at, or to fund 35 or 40% of the common portions of the building. And then with respect to within each of the individual areas, within the gymnasium, within the health center, within the economic development office or the nation administration office, each of those individual portions of the buildings would be responsible for what are referred to as tenant improvements. And so I'll just use economic development office as an example there. So the tenants of that economic development office would be responsible for furnishing the interior walls, the finishing of those interior walls, the flooring and so forth of their own tenancy. So yeah, so that would typically be the approach that would be used in a multi-purpose building to allocate both the overall costs of the building, which would be shared according to floor space essentially, and then individually within the individual components would be the responsibility of that of the individual tenant. So that's again what we're seeing. We're seeing more of these multi-purpose buildings, and that gives us a sense then of how they could be developed and how the costs could be shared. So now I'd like to turn it, if I may, back over to Jason Reeves to walk us through some of the more detailed cost allocation thinking.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so as John described, Finney could help a nation to develop this type of multi-use building. And this includes the development of a financial model to support this project. So this slide just describes how Finney might approach the capital and O&M costs in such a model. So first, we recognize that there are different user groups or beneficiaries of the multi-purpose building. So for those costs associated with the nation's administrative office and the community and recreation center, the approach would be to seek contributions from Canada. And for those costs associated with the health center, the approach would be to seek contributions from ISK, or in the case of the project is in BC, from the First Nations Health Authority. And for the portion of costs associated with the nation's corporate entities, the approach would be to seek contributions from, their own net incomes earned by those businesses using that office space. Throw it back to Jason now.
Yeah, no, thanks, guys. That's two great scenarios. I know scenarios that we've heard from different nations and the work that we've been doing. We have been working on a water project with a nation in Ontario. And we have been working with the First Nations Health Authority here in BC, thinking about nations that want to have a multi-purpose facility, and we've been working with the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, thinking about water projects as well. And it's interesting to think about these different scenarios and responding, because there's different realities for the different organizations, for the different nations. There's different priorities that they have, and so really thinking through how can Finney support the nations where they're at, and thinking a little bit back to that initial life cycle slide that we talked about at the start, that talked about providing that support where nations are interested in having support, knowing that there's certain things that need to get done for a project to be successful. So if there are certain areas that nations want a bit of support, that's the idea behind Finney. This is a bit of a complicated picture here, really kind of summarizing what Jason was talking about, what John was talking about in a little bit different way. Thinking about in the middle of the diagram here, we're showing a First Nation, and this idea of this picture is thinking through the capital costs of a project. The First Nation has an infrastructure project. We're not very specific here about what that project is. We're just saying it's a project. But what we're thinking about is, well, what's the financial model, and how would the nation, in this case, a single nation, use the tools of the Fiscal Management Act to support them getting their project prepared, to really think through the financial plan, at least one aspect of it, the capital cost part here of the project. So on the left-hand side, we see a number of funding and revenue sources, including, transfers from Canada, could be from ISK, could be from other parts of Canada. We also see local revenue. That's a technical term, actually, from the Fiscal Management Act, which refers to things like Jason was talking about today. All those different tools can get called local revenues, whether it's property tax, whether it's development cost charge, whether it's a service tax or a fee. Those are things that nations have the ability to use if they choose, and to generate revenue from their lands. Other revenue is actually also a technical term, which relates to again, things that Jason talked to today, which is, that was a really good list, actually, Jason. Whether it's revenues from like a run-of-the-river hydroelectric project, gaming revenues, some sort of other impact benefit agreement. You may have a band-owned business that is earning income. That could be an other revenue. Those types of revenues can also be used. And in this scenario, we're seeing the nations collecting revenues. They're using the tools of the Fiscal Management Act to collect their revenues. The tax commission sets the standards for those laws and provides support for a nation to pass those laws. Then they're looking to say, well, geez, we don't have enough money in 1 year to build our project, but over time we think we're going to be able to collect the money to afford the project. Let's go to the finance authority to get a loan today, and we'll repay the loan with the local revenues or the other revenues that we collect over time. Now, in order to qualify for a loan from the finance authority, it's important to have good financial management systems. And that's the whole idea behind the financial management board, is to strengthen your financial management system, make sure you're in a good place where you can afford to have the loan and repay it. And so you're using those three institutions. And then we see Finney on the right hand side talking about some of the things we've talked about today: support getting your business case developed, pulling your project plan together. So that's kind of the idea behind this. I know we're up against the clock here, guys, and want to provide an opportunity for people to ask questions. We have this last slide here, and this is just to reflect the fact that we're very cognizant of the issue with O&M and the lack of O&M funding that exists, or the way that currently infrastructure works, which seems to lead to the assets not lasting as long as they should. And one of the things we really think a lot about at Finney is building a financial plan that considers the whole of life costs. So we're thinking about what are those other tools, and Jason did, I think, it's such a great job talking about how some of the tools are really good for upfront costs, and some are also good for ongoing costs. And so that's what this slide is talking about. So I'm going to sort of conclude here and just say thanks so much to John and Jason for the great presentation on the different projects. And I find it really interesting to talk about these scenarios. And I just want to provide an opportunity. I see we have a smaller group today. But if anyone had questions or comments or wanted to talk about their own project and how you're approaching it, we'd love to hear from you.
I see Chief Michelle Edwards with a hand.
Oh, great. Michelle.
Oh, thank you for the presentation. That was good. I've been going through these courses with the First Nations or the Tulo School of Indigenous Economics. So quite helpful as a chief to kind of know about infrastructure in our community. But I had one question, and it even stumps me in school, but I do have some comments on, was the development cost charges. When you say they're growth related costs, like, do you have one or two examples of what where those revenues could be collected? Like, what is a development cost charge? I don't really get that.
Jason, have you been waiting your whole life for this question to be asked?
Yes,
Sorry, John, I know you both want to answer it.
John's got way more experience than me. I'm going to let John do it, but basically it comes down to future. So please have at it, John.
Thanks so much, Chief Edwards. So if we think back to the map that we saw earlier, and I'll think about the future in that case, in that hypothetical example. Yeah, great, thanks. If we could go back to, actually a couple, just two forward, please. Yeah, so probably the best way to think about it is if we said this water system that we see here with the dotted lines and the supply and the treatment, if it's being built bigger than it needs to be at this time, in order to accommodate those waterfront lease lots future that are shown in the striped purple color.
Mm-hmm.
So then, yeah, so we're building some extra capacity into this water system. And when those waterfront lease lots are developed in the future, at the time either that the lands are subdivided through survey, or a building permit would be taken out for each of the lots to go on those, they're going to throw money into a pot, and that money is going to go back to pay for the extra capacity that was built into that water system in the first place. Yeah. Okay,
so it's not a fee that you're charging, at the immediate, at the right now. It's money that you're putting away for future growth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I get that now. Thank you. Should have asked that like 3 months ago. And then on the, when you're talking about all these funds, and one thing we did with negotiation, and you know, sometimes negotiations could take years, right? But what we did with Ministry of Transportation is we negotiated an operations and maintenance fee, and it was about $900,000, and it's something that I would like to ask because I've seen you would do workshops. So maybe for my O&M department, just to help them maybe forecast their costs of what some of our O&M budgets can and should look like for the future. But I'm just wondering if that's something that you guys have ever thought of as when you're working with communities, if they're in negotiations. And most industry governments are more favorable to saying, oh, you have these already stipulated costs and projects instead of just giving them money, and then everybody fights over that, right? I would rather actually have something set in stone for what money's going to be used for, instead of, you know, just putting it somewhere and then, you know, you're just kind of pulling little pots here. But I think that you know, Modi actually jumped all over that and said, yeah, we would actually give you funding for, and it, in their eyes, it was 20 years of a budget, which was $900,000. So it was a certain amount of money in their mind that we were using for O&M costs for road maintenance, well, mainly road maintenance. So, you know, we purchased equipment and things like that, got our sand shed and think our trucks ready for sanding our roads. We live in the mountains. So I'm just hoping that's something that maybe Finney can actually include when they're working with communities. Maybe it's wording in a negotiation document, or how to write it into a negotiation, but that's uncertain because negotiations could go on forever. So you'd actually want to do it more, and maybe the companies would actually build infrastructure. I think that industry, if they're coming through our community, should actually be building our infrastructure, not having to rely on INAC or anybody, because half of the time they're useless and, you know, don't give you enough money, or they come back and they don't really help. They've got money, but they're not helpful, right? So I think industry, that would be a good way to get our infrastructure built. But it goes to what we're running into now, and not only us, but everybody across Canada has to do an infrastructure upgrade. And at some point, it would be nice if First Nations or Finney, to be a start, would be the place to go for when you're upgrading or you're needing to build new, that would be our industry, right? That's nobody else's. We are the ones to come to, and we're going to rebuild Canada basically by having great infrastructure. So, you know, everybody is healthy at the end of the day. But that would be my vision, is that we are the ones who are rebuilding Canada, and meaning the infrastructure. So I will contact you guys just about hosting a workshop for my community to talk, because we're looking at doing a huge build. The municipality can't build anywhere, so we're gonna build for them basically. We'll host them in our community, and so we just need to figure out what that's going to look like. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief. Great comments about the operation and maintenance budget and understanding what that budget and the requirements are. I know my understanding of how the current system works is that you know, there tends to be a lot of focus on the construction costs and not as much focus on the operation and maintenance costs. And also, we may not have as much input into the construction the way it's done, and it sort of just gets handed over to nations without maybe a solid plan behind the O&M. So one of the things we've talked about, and then maybe John or Jason have additional comments here, but is as we're planning new projects, really taking into account that whole of life costs, with the idea being that you would have that information then in, to say, well, this is what the costs are. We've thought about, how we're going to have to manage this, the management case part and the financial case. This is how the people we're going to need to be trained, to be able to work on the project, to operate it and to maintain it. This is the kind of equipment. This is the timing of the, major maintenance maybe that needs to get done over time. And even I sort of always think, oh, these projects are long, like, we'll worry about the operations, but like, do you really need to think about the replacement? But that replacement's really important as well, because geez, time goes faster than you think, and which I'm finding out sadly as I get older here. And all of a sudden you're 25 years down the road and you haven't thought about that replacement. Now you're saying, geez, my asset is being held together with duct tape and I'm trying to MacGyver this thing to continue to work for a while, and we're trying to wait for more funding, but what's the wait list like? So I think having, like, you raised such important points about thinking through that whole of life. I don't know, John, did you want to have a comment about that?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I don't, would I be able to do a share screen? I'm not sure if if Davis or Jason, if you could enable that.
I think you should be able to, John.
Yeah, okay. I'm just going to see if I can pull something up here. Please let me know if that shows up on everyone's screen. Yeah, okay, thanks, Davis. So Chief Edwards and others on the call, what this little pie chart shows, and this would be for if we use water system or roads or any of the linear infrastructure as an example, it shows what we'll call it engineering, but that would be the design part of the project. And then the blue is the construction part. And then all of this red, which represents something like 75 or 80% of the cost of any infrastructure project, is the operations and maintenance. And so what Chief Edwards is referring to here is so, and others are so critically important, because, we often think, oh, it's going to cost quite a bit to build this project, but it's really the ongoing operations and maintenance that, one, is extremely costly, and two, can provide incredible opportunities, as Jason is mentioning, for the nation to be involved in that operations and maintenance with, and in some cases with funding and other support that could be coming from Chief Edwards mentioned, from industry, whether that be Provincial Ministry of Transportation, whether that be a pipeline company, whether that be an independent power producer, whatever it is, whatever industry is coming into the community, could provide some support for all of this, including the operations and maintenance piece of it. So again, really important conversation, Chief Edwards, and just wanted to give us kind of all of us an overall picture of how critical operations and maintenance is. Great, thank you all. I'll abandon the screen sharing.
Great, and Chief Edwards will be sure to follow up after this to connect about a workshop. Graham, you had a question or a comment that you wanted to make.
Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. One of my jobs with, I work for Wet'suwet'en First Nation, which is in the Wet'suwet'en territory. One of my jobs is working with, we have an education society, and in the CCP in 2018, there's probably the most information about the possible new education facility. Currently, we have a lot of different areas within the community with different programs. So we're trying to look into creating one new facility just specifically for education and childcare. I guess my question would be, and I'm meeting with ISK next week about potential feasibility, funding, and all that. But yeah, I think that just the first, maybe the first step into getting the ball rolling with this. It's a huge project, obviously. So just was kind of curious as to what you guys think about the first step in this process. Thanks.
I know that's a great question. How do you get started on a project? get the ball rolling. And we spent a little bit of time, we kind of glossed over it a little bit today because we've been building up these different concepts. But I wonder, John, I know we've talked about the life cycle and that process. Would you be willing to comment a little bit about, getting the project team together and getting the ball rolling?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jason and Graham. Great question. So, yeah, a couple parts of it. One would be the project team and how they're going to work together. And so, in your case, Graham, that sounds like it would be the nation with Wet'suwet'en, along with ISK, along with if there were specific kind of user groups within, or well, user groups being, it sounds like a childcare and the education group. And so, assembling that group and then preparing what we're referring to as a project charter, which kind of says, here's our objectives as a group, how we're going to work together. And again, we've got some examples here that I think Jason and Davis have mentioned in terms of what a project charter might look like. So that's a really good starting spot. And then you're bang on with respect to the next logical step, which is the feasibility study to say, to hopefully secure some funding from ISK to retain someone, likely an architect, to assist with that feasibility study to say, here's our objectives for the building, here's how it could be programmed, here's what the physical space might look like, and here's some cost estimates for what it would be. Would really support to engaging the community to the greatest extent you can in that exercise. We haven't talked a lot about that this morning, but one of the things that we found working through any kind of, be it linear infrastructure projects like water systems and so on, or buildings, is the absolute critical value of engaging the community to the greatest extent right from the start and through the whole infrastructure life cycle, designing the infrastructure, figuring out how it might be constructed, including opportunities for nation members and businesses to be involved in construction. So anyway, you're off to a great start, but would suggest a project starter. And again, we've got some examples that could be used, and then the feasibility study.
All right, thank you. You're calling that, sorry, a project starter?
Oh, charter.
Okay.
Yeah. Right on.
Graham, there's actually, and Davis has popped the link into the chat box, but if you go to the Finney webpage, there's a resources tab there.
Okay.
And there's an outline sort of table of contents, and certainly be happy to, once you have a chance to look at it, if you wanted to chat further about what might go in there, I'd be happy to chat. So great,
Yes,
great
perfect.
comments and questions. And sorry, Graham, did you want to follow up?
No, I'm just saying there's so many resources out there that it almost makes your head spin. So it's kind of just like you got to start somewhere. And I didn't even know about you guys till 2 days ago. The manager actually sent this to me. So I was like, wow, okay, this is kind of connecting a lot of things in my head. And we are currently certified with the FMB. And so we've done a lot of good things. But it's definitely, we got all this in place, but it's just getting us started is the first step, obviously. So appreciate this webinar.
That's a really good, I think, note. Like, there's a lot of tools we talked about today that are already existing in the Fiscal Management Act, or, you may have tools you developed, pursuant to a land code, for example, a land use plan. And it's like, how do you bring all these things together to achieve your goal, which is, what is that goal? Is it actually to build a building, like you mentioned? Like, maybe that's not even your goal for the school. It's, you want to create a safe space for people to have a learning environment, and how are you going to do that? And thinking about all these different tools, like, I think that's a real exciting part of thinking about infrastructure projects, and exciting part about the First Nation Infrastructure Institute. We know there's a big infrastructure gap. We know there's a big need. We know that nations have ideas and priorities that they've established through their community processes. And we think that with some support, like some of the tools we're talking about and the approaches we're talking about, that really we could take some more steps to closing that gap, right? Which would really improve the lives of a lot of people, we think. So we're really grateful that you're able to join us today, and I know we're a little bit past our time, respecting everyone's schedule today. I would certainly be happy to connect with each of you afterwards if you want to reach out to us. We'll be following up with an email with a resource summarizing some information about these costs and the slides. And just before we close, maybe I'll just provide an opportunity to pass it back to our development board chair, Alan Claxton, to close our morning webinar.
Hey, well, thank you, Jason, and John for the presentation. Thank you, Davis, for the coordination of the audio and visual. And a special thank you to all the participants and the great questions today. As you all know, we all have many infrastructure needs in all of our communities. And right from needing clean drinking water to solid, safe roads with sidewalks and good lighting, to community building that's going to benefit all the members in our communities from the oldest to the youngest. And this is what we wanted to provide with Finney to support all communities in Canada to help them move forward in a proactive, positive way. And so let's keep moving forward. And once again, thank you all participants, and continue to stay safe, and continue to provide support for all your members, and especially the ones that are in real need right now because of the pandemic. And the vaccinations are getting closer, so, and the weather's getting warmer, and everything is starting to look more positive. So let's carry on that momentum, and look forward to the next webinar next week. HKCM, thank you very much, and really appreciate you all being on this webinar today. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.